Hi everyone, welcome to, I guess, how class is going to be from now on. I want to thank everyone for being patient with me, taking time to get everything set up so that we'd be able to continue the semester without being able to meet in class. And obviously, with campus closing, things have been very difficult and confusing for everybody, so I want to just again thank all of you for being patient with me as I try to figure out how I want to continue with the class. So from now on, this is how we're going to be having our class meetings, and we're going to just be, or I guess I'm going to be recording videos and just putting them on YouTube for you guys to watch. So now we're going to get started with our first lesson. So now we've basically finished everything that is important to continue with the phonetics aspect of the class, so we're going to be moving on from phonetics and phonology and those kinds of things, and moving on to the new part of the class, which is going to deal with logic and logical fallacies. So I'm sure you're all very excited to be done with all the phonetics and the IPA and all that. Now we're going to move on to something new now that you've finished with tests and all that, and this is going to be particularly important for getting started with your speeches, and specifically your persuasive speeches. So this is going to help out a lot with that, making sure that your persuasion is based on sound logic. So I'm going to start with our introduction of logic and logical fallacies. So, as I said, the topic of this next portion of the course is going to be dealing with logic and errors in logic, which are called logical fallacies. So, just to introduce the concept very briefly, logic is a set of principles that can help people determine whether a claim is true. And so, obviously, when people tell you something and you're not sure whether or not to believe them, you want to think about whether or not what they're saying makes sense to determine if you're going to believe them and what they're saying, or possibly be convinced by whatever arguments they're going to make. So logic is that aspect of thinking and critically evaluating what people are saying to determine if you're going to accept what they say is true or reject what they're saying because it is false. And so by developing an understanding of logic and logical fallacies, you will be better able to evaluate claims people are making and the arguments that they're presenting to you, but this will also help you be able to make your own arguments a little more convincingly, and hopefully make sure that in the future, as you make arguments for different purposes, not only for the persuasive speech in this class, but for other purposes that you may need to have argumentative writing or speaking, you'll be able to construct sound arguments. So, to just get started very briefly, we're going to look at this argument here. It says, all people are mortal, Socrates is a person, therefore Socrates is mortal. Now, the objective is going to be to look at all aspects of this argument that's being presented and determine if this is a good argument or a bad argument. So, should we believe the claims in this argument and the conclusions that they draw? That's sort of the exercise that we're going to be going into. Before we can really thoroughly evaluate the argument, though, I need to introduce some terms that are useful and that are frequently used in logic. So, an argument is a statement or conclusion, and all of the evidence used to support that statement and conclusion. So, in the previous example, the argument would consist of all three statements. So that's all people are mortal, Socrates is a person, and therefore Socrates is mortal. Premises refer to specifically the statements that are evidence used to support an argument. So again, to refer to the previous example, the premises of the argument would be all people are mortal, Socrates is a person. Those are the two premises for that argument. The term valid can be pretty confusing for a lot of people when they first start learning about logic, because typically what people think valid means is that something is true, but that's not the case in logic and argumentation. So valid here is going to refer to an argument where there are no errors in the reasoning. So there will be no logical fallacies. And again, we'll get to the term fallacy in a little bit. Invalid is going to be the exact opposite. So invalid refers to an argument that does have errors in its logic and its reasoning. Sound is an argument that is both valid and true. So this is typically what people think of when they think of something that is valid. So obviously, because sound refers to an argument that is valid and true, it's possible to have arguments that are valid but not true, and it's also possible to have arguments that are true but not valid. So sound is going to refer to any argument that is both valid and an argument that has conclusions that are true. So a fallacy is a logical error or an error in reasoning that makes an argument invalid. Any argument that contains a fallacy is automatically invalid. And so, regardless of whether or not a true statement contains a fallacy, the argument that leads to that conclusion is invalid because there is an error in the reasoning that leads to that conclusion. So that's why we don't consider arguments that contain fallacies or arguments that are invalid. The last term is a syllogism. So a syllogism is a very simple sort of a structure for an argument, and it contains two premises and a conclusion. So what this means is that you have two statements, and then you have two pieces of evidence that support those statements. And so in a syllogism, if the premises of the syllogism are true, then the conclusion has to be true. So it's not possible to have two incorrect premises and a true conclusion if the reasoning of the syllogism is valid. So in a valid syllogism, your premises have to be true in order for your conclusion to be true. And I'll go more into depth describing syllogisms in just a bit. So, the example we looked at before, all people are mortal, Socrates is a person, therefore Socrates is mortal. This is a syllogism. The first two parts, so all people are mortal and Socrates are a person, are the premises of the syllogism. These are the pieces of evidence that determine whether or not the conclusion, Socrates is mortal, is true. Right, so if the syllogism is valid, we have to accept the conclusion as being true if the first two premises are true also. So what that means is that if we look at all three statements, so all people are mortal and Socrates is a person, those are our premises. If we believe those things are true, then the conclusion, Socrates is mortal, has to be true. So we're going to start to evaluate this syllogism. So we're going to look at whether or not the premises are true. So are all people mortal? Yes, all people are mortal. All people die. Right? Now the next premise, Socrates is a person. Is that true? Yes, that is true. So now we're not going to worry about evaluating the conclusion yet, because if the reasoning is valid and there are no logical errors, then the third statement, the conclusion, has to be true, because that is the structure of a syllogism. So we're going to look at whether or not this argument is valid. When we are evaluating a syllogism and deciding whether or not there are errors in reasoning, there's a particular way to draw diagrams of the syllogism to help that evaluation. So, we're going to start with the first statement, all people are mortal. We're going to represent this with a circle, and we're just going to label it people. then to demonstrate that all people are mortal, we have a larger circle around people, and that will be labeled mortal. So, you can see that this represents the idea that all people are mortal, because the entirety of the circle labeled people is contained by the circle labeled mortal. So anything in the circle that's people, right, so any person would go in the people circle, and anything that is in that circle automatically has to be mortal, because there's no part of the people circle that is outside of the mortal circle. So now the second part is Socrates is a person. The way to indicate that we're referring to a specific person is to just put an X. So now we have an X representing Socrates inside the people circle. So this means that Socrates is a person. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. So to determine if Socrates is mortal, we just need to verify that the X representing Socrates is inside the circle labeled mortal, which in this case it is. Now, to determine if this is valid, we have to see, is there any way for Socrates, our X, to be inside the people circle, but outside of the mortal circle? And because that's not possible, the people circle is completely inside the mortal circle. So anything inside the people circle will also be inside the circle of things that are mortal. So there are no other options but for the X to be in the mortal circle, which makes this a valid argument. Now, because this conclusion is true, and all of the premises are true, which we determined earlier, this makes the argument sound. So this means that the syllogism, all people are mortal, Socrates is a person, therefore Socrates is mortal, we have to accept all of that as true, and the conclusion that it draws, Socrates is mortal, is also true. So in this example, there are no errors in the logic, and every assertion that is made is true. So there is no reason to reject the conclusion that Socrates is mortal. So now we're going to look at another syllogism. So our next syllogism is all people are mammals, Alex is a mammal, therefore Alex is a person. So this looks very similar to our first example referring to Socrates. So we're going to start off in the same way. So look at the first two claims. Are all people mammals? Yes, they are. And our second claim, Alex is a mammal. Let's just say, yes, Alex is a mammal. We're not going to pretend Alex is the name of a snake or a chair or something like that. So we're going to say Alex is a mammal for this example. Does that lead to a conclusion where Alex is a person? Right, so are both of these arguments sound? Right, that means valid and true. We're going to evaluate this syllogism the same way we did all people are mortal, and Socrates is a person, therefore Socrates is mortal. So we are again going to have a circle representing people, and then inside and then around the people circle, we're going to draw a circle that is labeled mammal. So again, the entire people circle, right, that circle that represents people is completely inside a circle that represents mammals, which means that everything that is a person is also automatically a mammal. Now our next step is to say Alex is a mammal. So we need an X representing Alex inside the mammal circle, which we have here. So now, the conclusion, therefore Alex is a person. For this to be true, Alex has to be inside the people circle. But the thing we need to consider is, can Alex be inside the mammal circle without being in the people circle? Because the only conditions we have to satisfy is that all people are mammals, so the whole people circle has to be inside a larger circle labeled mammal, and then Alex has to be inside the mammal circle. We can move our X representing Alex outside of the people circle, but inside the mammal circle. Now in this picture, or this diagram, you can see that all people are mammals is still true in the drawing. So the entire people circle is inside a larger mammal circle, and our X representing Alex is inside the mammal circle. So this is an invalid syllogism because all people are mammals and Alex is a mammal does not require that Alex be a person. For example, Alex could be some other kind of mammal. Alex could be a cat or a dog or any other kind of mammal that is not a person. So even though the conclusion can be true, right, Alex can be a person, the conclusion does not have to be true. So that means that this syllogism has a logical flaw, or a fallacy. So, our syllogism here, all people are mammals, Alex is a mammal, therefore Alex is a person, contains a logical fallacy. When there are fallacies in syllogisms, those are called non sequiturs, which is Latin for it does not follow. The name of this syllogism comes from the fact that the conclusion does not automatically follow from the premises. Sort of a simpler way to say that is that the premises being true does not automatically make the conclusion true. So depending on what your exact syllogism says, there are different ways that you can draw the diagrams, and the way the diagrams look depends on what the actual statements in the syllogism are. So terms like all is represented by a smaller circle that fits completely inside of a larger circle. So in the case all people are mortal, we have a smaller circle representing people that fits in a larger circle representing things that are mortal. So in any case where you have all something are something, your all is going to be the smaller circle. So if you had all computers are electronic devices, your small circle would say computers, and your larger circle would say electronic devices. And so if you have a syllogism where you're using the word no, for example, no fish have legs, then to draw a diagram of that, you would have two circles that do not touch at all. So if you're going to say no fish have legs, you would have one circle labeled fish and one circle labeled, has legs or just legs or whatever. But the important thing is that these circles do not touch at all. That way, anything inside the fish circle does not touch the legs circle. And the last one is some, which you draw a diagram of by having two circles that overlap, but the circles are not completely inside each other. So when you say some people have blue eyes, you draw a people circle, and that has to overlap with a blue eyes circle. But they do have to touch, but one can't fit all the way inside another one. For example, if you had the people circle all the way in the blue eyes circle, what that would actually mean is all people have blue eyes. And if you did it the other way, where the blue eyes circle is completely inside the people circle, that would mean all things with blue eyes are people. So if you want to say some people have blue eyes, you need to have part of the people circle outside of the blue eyes circle, and part of the blue eyes circle has to be outside of the people circle, which is what we have here. So, to get a little more practice with drawing diagrams of syllogisms, we're going to expand the no fish have legs example. So we start off with no fish have legs. So we have our two circles, fish and legs, and they have to be completely separate because, again, there are no fish with legs, so fish has to be completely separate from the legs circle. The next part, the second premise of the syllogism is all people have legs. So we're going to draw a people circle that fits completely inside of our has legs circle. And so again, this means that everything that is a person has legs. And then our conclusion is, therefore, no fish are people. So, to make sure that this is true, we need to make sure that the fish circle is completely separate from the people circle. And we need to make sure that there's no way for the people circle and the fish circle to touch, while still respecting our first two premises. So fish cannot touch the leg circle, and people have to be completely inside the leg circle. And with those two conditions, it is impossible for the fish circle and the people circle to touch in any way. So, this makes the syllogism, no fish have legs, all people have legs, therefore no fish are people, a valid syllogism. There is no way to there's no way to make the conclusion false with both of the premises being true. And then we'll have one more example. So some people have blue eyes. So again, we're going to start with our people circle and a blue eyes circle. And they need to overlap. But again, you can't have either circle all the way inside the other circle, because that would change the meaning. So, some people have blue eyes, where people and blue eyes are separate. Or not separate, but overlapping. And then Alex does not have blue eyes. So this, again, is going to be represented by an X, and our X has to be completely outside of the blue eyes circle, because Alex does not have blue eyes. So we can put Alex over here. And then our conclusion, Alex is not a person. So, is there any way for Alex to be inside the people circle without being in the blue eyes circle? Is essentially what we're going to look for to determine if this is a valid syllogism or not. And we can actually move Alex inside the people circle and still have Alex outside of the blue eyes circle. So, Alex could, for example, be a person with brown eyes instead of a person with blue eyes. So, this is an invalid syllogism because, again, both of the premises are true, and the conclusion can also be true, but it does not have to be true. So we could say, if Alex is a bird, for example, with brown eyes, then the conclusion would be true, but the conclusion can also be false if Alex is a person with brown eyes instead of some other kind of animal that doesn't have blue eyes. Right, so when you're dealing with syllogisms, there are a couple important things to remember. So just because the premises and conclusion of a syllogism are true does not mean that the argument is valid. So I'm just going to give another example of a syllogism where the premises and conclusion are true, but the reasoning is invalid. So the syllogism, all people have skin, Donald Trump has skin, therefore Donald Trump is a person. The diagram of the syllogism would look like this. So we have two circles again. The people circle is completely inside the skin circle to represent that all people have skin. And then we have an X to represent Donald Trump, which is only required to be inside the skin circle. We can put the X inside the skin circle, but outside of the people circle, so the conclusion that Donald Trump is a person because he has skin and all people have skin is invalid logic. Right? This is a non sequitur. And similarly, just because an argument has valid logic does not mean that the conclusion is automatically true. So in our syllogism here, all Americans are white. Barack Obama is American, therefore Barack Obama is white, is valid but false. So again, because of our all statement, we need a smaller circle labeled Americans inside a larger circle labeled white. And then to represent Barack Obama, we have an X inside the American circle. Because the X is in the American circle and the entirety of the American circle is inside the white circle, there is no way for an X in the American circle to be outside of the white circle. So, if the premises are true, then Barack Obama has to be white. However, obviously the first premise is false. Not all Americans are white. So even though the reasoning is valid, the conclusion is not true. So both of the examples here at the end are either valid or true, but neither argument is sound. And so the only kind of arguments that we should be using are sound arguments. So it would be illogical to be convinced by an argument that is either invalid or untrue. And so it's always important when you're constructing an argument to make sure that your premises and conclusions are true and that the reasoning that leads to your conclusion is valid. Right, so that is all I have for the moment to look at syllogisms, and so I'm going to provide you with some practice to work on determining if a syllogism is valid, and to draw diagrams of some syllogisms to get some practice evaluating whether or not an argument is not only true, but also whether or not it is valid. And so determining whether or not a syllogism is a sound argument. I'm also going to have you design some of your own syllogisms with an example of one that is valid and an example of a syllogism that is invalid. All right, so that's all for this little video, our class session. So make sure you're checking Blackboard every day for new homework and assignments and more of these kinds of videos with our sort of instructional content. And I will see you guys all later, and I'll make sure to notify you whenever there's new videos like this posted on YouTube and Blackboard. Right? So, bye.